On International Clinical Trials Day coming up on this podcast, we are talking to Professor Chris Fox from the University of Nottingham. Let's hear what he has to say about hitting cancer cells with a hammer, the frustration of being a professor involved in research, and how acute leukemia are accelerating clinical trials. Stay tuned. Welcome everybody to the latest episode of Let's Talk Blood Cancer, the Patients Podcast, hosted by me, Adam Joyce, patron of acute leukemia and former blood cancer patient myself. And today, joining me on the sofa all the way from the University of Nottingham is Professor Chris Fox, who is also a lymphoma specialist. Chris, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join us on the Patients Podcast. Tell us a little bit about you and your role.
Hi Adam, great to be here, and I think it's a really good venture, and I'm very happy to talk about blood cancer as we go through the conversation. So as you say, I'm a Professor of Haematology at the University of Nottingham, and I'm also a consultant haematologist at Nottingham University Hospitals Trust. So my practice is focused on lymphoma, so diagnosing, managing, treating patients who have one of these conditions that we call lymphoma. I'm also very much involved in clinical research, mainly clinical trials, so investigating new drugs and trying to improve treatments for patients with lymphomas.
And can you help us understand? I mean, my personal journey was a lymphoma journey, but can you help us understand and the viewers understand the difference between leukemia and lymphoma?
It's a very good question, and it's one that comes up commonly in conversations with patients. The first thing I think to recognise is that both lymphomas and leukemias are broad terms for many, many different conditions. So there are more than 50 types of lymphoma, for example, and many types of leukemia. But the key difference is that leukemia presents itself in the blood. So you find the cancer cells, the leukemia cells, in the blood. And in fact, the word leukemia comes from the Greek meaning white blood. So that's the origin of that word. Lymphomas tend to present more with lumps and bumps, so an enlarged lymph gland or a mass or a tumour within an organ. Mm-hmm. And lymphoma can present in any part of the body, actually. They're cancers of the immune system, but they can declare themselves, they can present in any part of the body. But they're the kind of key differences, I think, between leukemia and lymphoma.
Okay. So, Chris, tell us a bit about you in your early years, maybe when you went to university and how you ended up in medicine.
Oh, great question. I have to think many years back now, sadly. So I grew up in Leeds. I've got three brothers, none of whom did medicine, by the way. They did many different careers. My parents were teachers. I went to a pretty ordinary school. And then as I learnt through the lessons, so science, particularly a strong interest in science, but also a love of people and having conversations with people. And medicine seemed to be the right outcome for the combination of science and people. So I went to medical school in Leicester, and Leicester at that time had a very modern medical school course, an undergraduate degree, which involved patients and people very early on, rather than just doing the kind of a science bit in the lecture theatre or in the laboratory. So it was quite an integrated course. And then over the years, I guess, in my junior doctor years, getting a taste of different specialties, including haematology, and really liked that strong connection between the science and the people. And that really, I think, is why I ended up being a haematologist, but it's quite difficult to remember the exact moment.
It's funny how you say, I think that's when you went down one particular path. Is there something about haematology? You've referenced the science behind it, but is it the patient interactions or is it the science and the research that really drew you into that role?
I think it's probably a combination of both. I think haematology is different to many other medical specialties because of the close connection with the laboratory. And if we go back many decades before I was in the specialty, we didn't have very many good treatments to treat patients with blood diseases and blood cancer. And so haematologists were very laboratory based, diagnosing, looking down microscopes and doing tests in the lab. But over the decades, and particularly in the last decade or two, there's so many new treatments for patients. We're getting better at diagnosing patients, getting better at treating patients with blood cancers. They're living longer. And so our clinics now are huge because of all the patients that we're able to look after so well. So it is a journey, it is a connection between science and people, and the pendulum has swung more into the clinic, I think, in recent years and decades.
And you choosing to specialise in lymphoma, is it a choice to specialise, or is it almost expected of you as your career progresses?
In recent years, particularly, I think there's an expectation because even though I just treat patients with lymphoma, it's a huge area of medicine. You know, more than 50 types of lymphoma, very complex diseases, very complex treatments. So I think if you want to be a successful specialist and be good at your job, you really need to focus into one disease area. And I think that's becoming increasingly true as we get better diagnostics and we get better treatments, and the information you have to learn and the experience you need really needs to be focused in a particular disease area, at least in university hospitals where we see the more complex diseases.
And being so specialist, Chris, is there a cohort of lymphoma specialists? Have you got people that you can bounce off?
Yeah, we've got a great community actually in the UK, and we have a national group, a lymphoma study group, whose main purpose is research, but we're also involved in patient advocacy and in education and in writing guidelines for doctors who specialise in lymphoma. So we have a very good network, a good community, and we're often talking by email or on the phone about difficult patients.
So you're not in it alone then, which is
no, definitely not.
Good to hear. Do you have a career influencer, if you like? Is there anybody that you can think about on your journey to where you are now, whether it could be a patient, it could be a colleague, anyone who's particularly influenced where you are now?
I think as you go through medicine and go through medical training and start to specialise, you certainly have mentors, even if they're informal mentors or role models, even if you don't recognise it at the time, that I think do influence what specialty you do and maybe how you practice. So I can certainly remember some haematologists now retired who I worked with in Nottingham in both the stem cell transplant area and also in the area of lymphoma. And then also some, I guess, scientific mentorship or scientific role models from when I did my PhD at the University of Birmingham, actually. So I think there was a few key people, I think, that did influence how I thought about problems and maybe influence which area I was interested in.
I'm dying to ask you, do you think you are anyone's influence with the up-and-coming clinicians, or are you too humble to?
I'm far too modest to say, but I think so. I think there's a responsibility actually as a relatively senior clinician and a senior researcher to the responsibility to be a good role model. We're inherently involved in a lot of teaching and education, even if it's just in the clinic or at the bedside. So I think it's important to recognise that we're not just a doctor, we're also educators and role models. But others will judge how good I am at any of those roles.
And you're referencing how busy you are. Can you kind of talk us through what a typical week in your working world looks like?
So my role, because it's effectively split between research and the clinic and seeing patients in clinic, each day is quite different for me. So approximately half of my week, maybe 3 days a week, I'll be in the hospital, either in a clinic seeing patients who are having treatment for lymphoma, or on the wards, so patients who are inpatients in the beds in the hospital in our units, seeing those patients who are having inpatient treatment or recovering from complications of treatment. So that's probably about 3 days a week. And my other 2 days a week, I really focus on research. And as I mentioned before, in my case, it's designing and delivering clinical trials, so investigating new drugs, trying to work out how we can improve treatments for patients. So some of that's desk-based, some of it's talking, having conferences with either pharmaceutical companies or other colleagues around the UK or even internationally about how we can work together to deliver good trials and good drugs for patients. So a bit of a mixed working week, really.
And you talk about trials, and you've already mentioned that you really enjoyed the science behind haematology. But what pulled you into research? Because would I be right in thinking there's no obligation for you to become involved in research? You could continue as a doctor. Would that be right?
That's right. I think doing research, certainly the kind of depth and breadth of research I do is a choice for sure. I think it's difficult to be a haematologist and be completely separated from research because that's how we've made progress with treatments. That's how we're making progress now, and that's how things will improve in the future. So you can be largely just a clinician. You can be largely a clinician, a haematologist, without doing much research. But you might still be looking after patients on a clinical trial, even if you're not designing that trial and delivering that trial as a researcher. But it's difficult to be separated completely from research, I think.
And you said then, looking after these people who are on a trial, can you help us understand what is involved in a patient who becomes part of a trial?
It's a really good question, and I think there is a bit of mystery, maybe unnecessarily, but there's a bit of mystery around clinical trials. And in some cases, patients are concerned when they hear about a trial because they might be concerned that they're being used as a guinea pig.
Yeah.
And the first thing to remember is that all the trials that we run have gone through huge amounts of approval. So from the medicines regulator, the MHRA, that's just the UK body that regulates medicines and makes sure it's safe to give medicines to patients, and that includes clinical trials, as well as going through ethical approval and other kind of structure of how the trials are regulated. So any trial that's open at a hospital, available to a patient in a hospital, has gone through all of these layers of approval. And as a general rule, patients who are involved in a trial generally have better outcomes than patients who are not enrolled in trials, irrespective of what type of trial.
Wow.
And then you've got a whole range of different types of clinical trials. So you've got what we call early phase. So that's when medicine's very new and it's just being tested. And that could even be for the first time, that we call first in human. So people taking this drug where no one has ever taken it
Would the
before.
patient know that?
They absolutely have to know that for sure. We have to be very transparent about the information we give. And that's a really key part of clinical trials is explaining complex things to patients, putting it in lay language and making sure they know what the pros and cons are, make sure they know what the normal treatment would be, the standard treatment would be if they weren't on a trial. So these are all important questions that patients should ask. And then the trials run all the way through to what we call phase 3, where you're directly comparing a new drug or a new treatment against a standard treatment. So there might be a standard chemotherapy treatment that somebody has with lymphoma, and then there's another a newer treatment which we hope and think will be better than the standard treatment, and then patients go into that trial, and they're usually randomised. So that means a coin is tossed virtually by a computer, and patients are allocated one treatment or another. And usually, but not always, they'll know which treatment they're allocated.
Okay.
So there's a whole, as you can see, it's quite complicated, and there's a whole range of trials, right from testing a medicine from the first time to then proving that it's working. And then that might be adopted then into routine practice as a new treatment if it's successful.
But why are these trials so important for blood cancer, lymphomas? Because we talk a lot about trials and the bearing that they have.
Yeah.
Why are they so important?
I think because our understanding of the diseases based on scientific research has really accelerated in the past few years. So now we understand many things about why a cancer cell decides to grow and how it survives and how a cancer cell might die or how we might be able to kill it with drugs. And all of that science has really provided a kind of a platform for lots of new drugs. So we've got many new drugs that we've never had, that we didn't have 10 years ago. And the only way we have those in practice, and we can use many of these now in the clinic, funded by the NHS in normal care, the only way that's happened is because trials have been undertaken to prove that they're safe and effective. And that allows the company who's developing the drug to have a license, which means they're legally allowed to sell it, and then the NHS makes a decision about whether it's cost effective, whether it's a good enough treatment to use on the NHS. So without trials, you don't really get new treatments in the NHS in standard practice.
So forgive me then, Chris, because we've got some effective blood cancer and lymphoma treatments, haven't we? If we didn't have trials, what position would we be in? Because some of the treatment works, doesn't it?
Yes. It's a very good question, and for lymphomas generally, and again, there are many different types. Some have better prognosis than others, some are easier to treat than others. But broadly speaking, we have successful treatments for most lymphomas. And so just give you some very rough figures, maybe 2/3 of patients would have or 3/4 of patients with the common lymphomas would have a very successful outcome, either be cured of their disease or live well without it or with it for many years. Without the trials, we'd then just be stuck, really. Would be that figure I gave, those broad figures I gave you, 2/3 or 3/4 of patients, that would just stay static. Whereas what we want to do is to be providing better treatments and increasing that percentage to, ideally, we want to be able to cure everyone who has any kind of blood cancer. And we're making progress towards that, but there's obviously a bit of work to do. And the only way to make that progress is to develop new drugs and to test those drugs in trials.
And what have you seen yourself, if we say the last 10 years, of the change in patient outcomes because of clinical trials?
The last 10 years particularly has been really rapid change. So we've got a whole new portfolio, a whole new basket of drugs that we just didn't have 10 years ago. And some of these drugs are quite remarkable. They can help the patient's own immune system, the good bits of their immune system, to fight the cancer, which is often the bad bit of the immune system, if you like. And so we really learned very rapidly, and we've seen some dramatic changes in patients who are alive today because of the treatment who wouldn't have been even 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So there's really transformative, impactful treatments that are certainly having a huge impact on patients and their families.
And you were telling me about how you need to have some very challenging conversations sometimes with patients and explain the trials in depth to them. Are there any common misconceptions that you see, perhaps public misconceptions, about clinical trials? You used the term guinea pigs earlier. I'm guessing that's one, isn't it, that the patient may feel that that's what they're being used as. Yeah. Any other examples you can give me of public misconception?
Yeah, I think there are some misconceptions. People naturally worry that the trial might not be in their interests. They might worry that the trial is purely for the benefit of the drug company, for example, or of the hospital that's running the trial. But I think all the trials we do, the focus and the aim of the trial is to make the treatment either better in terms of more successful, or make a treatment safer or have less side effects. So I think the first thing to communicate to patients is this really is about trying to improve that patient's treatment at that time. Another misconception, I think, is that the patient wouldn't know what treatment they're having. Most of the time that's not true. Most of the time the treatment is known, and the patient will know quite a bit about the drug sometimes, unless it's one of those very early first-in-human trials I mentioned. So often there's quite a lot of information already about the drug, and it's only in some particular trials where the treatment is what we call blinded, and that's where the patient wouldn't know whether they're getting treatment A or treatment B. But in that situation, as I said, the ethical approvals and the regulatory approvals make sure that either treatment A or B is not compromising the patient. They're not missing out on something that they would have.
What might be the reason that somebody is blinded?
That is a good question. It's mainly to try and make sure that when the results are analysed, when patients have all finished their treatment and we're looking at the information and the data, whether that's survival or side effects, to make sure that it's a kind of a clean, unbiased analysis. So, for example, if you're trying to prove that a treatment has less side effects than another treatment, if you believe that treatment A had less side effects than treatment B, then when you look at the trial afterwards, you might be inclined to play down some data or symptoms, whatever. So it's the kind of cleanest way to do it, particularly in terms of side effects. So that's probably the way to think about it.
Perfect sense now that you've answered that for me. And when it comes to having these conversations with your patients, clearly the hope from you and your team is that the trial is a huge success. But how do you manage those expectations? And I guess the second part to that question is, when things don't go as you'd have hoped, what then?
Yeah, really good point. So I think the first thing I would say is that when a patient agrees to take part in the trial and they've had enough information and they're kind of happy to proceed, they can still change their mind. So if in a few weeks' time or a few months' time, if the treatment's not suiting them or if they're having lots of side effects, then have a conversation with your specialist, and then we can take them off the trial and give them a standard treatment. So that's probably an important message to communicate. And then it really depends what phase of trial that the patient's in. Some patients have a blood cancer or a lymphoma in the patients I treat, where the standard treatments have failed, that they've just not worked. The lymphoma has come back, for example, and we've run out of kind of normal options. In that situation, a trial often offers real hope and a real opportunity for a treatment that they just wouldn't be able to have otherwise. And then a different scenario is where you're comparing a treatment A and treatment B. It might be at the end of that trial that treatment B is exactly the same as treatment A, and there's no difference at all between them, but we've learned from the trial, we've learned information. The patient may not have directly benefited, except with all the monitoring and extra care they get within a trial.
So that would be my next question then. So I think you've almost touched on what success perhaps looks like for you there. So to find out that a trial and a conventional drug do the same thing, is that a trial success? Because I'm thinking as the layperson here, for me, trial success would be that I'm cured.
Yeah.
So what does success look like for you?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And from the patient perspective, what the patient wants quite rightly and what the doctor wants for the patient is for a better outcome than they would have had otherwise. So success is, the ultimate success is curing the blood cancer, curing the lymphoma so that it never returns, and having as few side effects as possible, a really safe treatment. And that's the kind of road we're going down, that's the target. But along the way we have trials that are so-called negative trials. That's a word that's sometimes used in the medical community. I don't really like the word negative because because we have learned information. So even if treatment A isn't better than treatment B and they're exactly the same, then we've learned information which will be helpful to future
forward,
patients. Yeah, exactly. So that patient within that trial may not have directly benefited, apart from the additional monitoring and looking after really that they get within a trial, but they can know that they're helping future generations of patients because we're able to use the information even if the trial wasn't a success for an individual.
Do you find trials really exciting? Are they the kind of, are they events that keep you awake and keep you motivated every day?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that it is a major motivation for me and many clinicians or researchers like me, because again, going back to what the aim of taking part in a trial or doing a trial is, it's to give patients better outcomes, and that might mean curing more patients living longer, having less side effects, and combining that aspiration, that aim from the patient perspective with the science and with the new drugs is really the kind of one of the big motivations, I think, yeah.
And Cure Leukemia, we fund research nurses and support the infrastructure of trials, and of course may sound like a leading question, but how important is that? Yeah.
So I probably should say that I have quite a big role in what's called the TAP network. So one of my other hats I wear on another day of the week is medical director of what we call the TAP network.
Yep.
And the idea is to kind of bring new treatments to patients more quickly through trials. And the way this works is we have a network of 15 hospitals throughout the UK who have funding through Cure Leukemia into the TAP network to pay for the salary of someone involved in research. It's usually a research nurse. It could be a research pharmacist, for example, because they're also really important. And that allows those hospitals to have access to more trials and to open those trials and provide drugs to patients more quickly. So that's the acceleration bit of TAP. The middle letter is do things more quickly, because we can see on the horizon many new exciting drugs, but all the governance, all the rules around trials and all the contracting with pharmaceutical companies can be quite slow. And so by providing this funding, Cure Leukemia funding the TAP network, that really compresses the time, it shortens the time between having a new drug and getting it to a patient. So I think it's really crucial that the TAP network funding from Cure Leukemia, things would be slower, more cumbersome, and fewer patients would get the drugs they needed through the trials.
Do you find that frustrating? Because I know personally, if I can see something that needs doing, I want to get it done straight away. How do you manage your frustrations that I'm assuming you must have about the slow pace of things?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head, actually. The word frustration is definitely, unfortunately, there in our working weeks. Sometimes things, that are outside our control, like, for example, the contracting. So some trials are funded by charitable bodies or they're funded by pharmaceutical companies. And however you do that, however that arrangement is made, you still need a contract between the university or the hospital that's in charge of the trial, has the responsibility, with the pharmaceutical company that might be providing the drugs, usually providing the drugs, sometimes providing funding. And the contracting is very slow. traditionally has been very slow, and it can take many, many months, sometimes a year, for the legal teams on the different sides from the university or the hospital and in the pharmaceutical company to agree on this contract. Now, it's beyond me why it takes 6-12 months for that to happen, and that is incredibly frustrating. So that's probably one of the biggest frustrations in setting up a trial. You know what you want to do, you've got agreement in principle to do it, but you can't get that drug to that patient and get the patient on the trial maybe for a year, sometimes 2 years. So the TAP network is definitely part of shortening that time and accelerating the access.
And bringing the positivity back into it again with Q Leukemia's involvement and the TAP network. Am I right in thinking it is that simple, that by funding Q Leukemia nurses and improving that infrastructure, that not only do we reduce that period that you were talking about, but we can almost take some of that emotional burden away from experts like you?
Yeah, I think that's right. And you know, the clinicians or the clinical researchers of people like me or my colleagues, we need a team to run a trial. You can't do it on your own. And effectively, you've got two teams. You've got a team that's involved in the setup of the trial, sometimes in what we call a clinical trials unit, which may sit within the university or may be connected to the TAP network. That's one team setting up the trials, doing all the contracting, the financial discussions and so on. Then you've got the team in the hospital, the people on the front line, as you might say, you know, your research nurses who are there giving the information to patients, giving them the opportunity to take part in the trial, talking about what a trial is and what it involves. And then you've got a whole load of other people, pharmacists, radiologists, people who look at scans, scientists who are doing the laboratory tests for the trial. So it's a really big team effort, and the Cure Leukemia funding for the TAP nurses, as we call them, the research nurses at the hospital, is a really key component of that team.
And you've just answered. I'm sitting here thinking, well, what would the void be without Q Leukemia? And is it as simple as saying, well, it's just the absence of everything wonderful that you've just mentioned? Yeah,
I think you'd be removing, you know, funding for one of the most key personnel, the key staff members, a research nurse. And the knock-on effect would be fewer patients would get access to trials because the 15 hospitals that I mentioned, they cover probably about 25 million people if you look at the different catchment areas. And obviously only a small fraction of those population will develop a blood cancer. But everyone who's diagnosed with a blood cancer should, in my view, and I think many in the community share this, should be offered the opportunity where possible to take part in a trial because we know the positive effect it has. So without that research nurse, that key person funded by Cure Leukemia through the TAP network, things would be slower and fewer patients would have access to trials. So it's really impactful.
Is lymphoma treatment evolving quick enough? I guess quick enough for you or quick enough generally?
I think the treatments we have seen developed in the last, you know, particularly the last 10 years for patients with lymphoma has moved very quickly. But I guess the other side of the coin from the patient perspective is maybe it's not moving quickly enough. Until we've offered a treatment that can cure everyone with lymphoma, then arguably our work is not done. So there's always a gap between where we want to get to and where we are, but the road is moving. The road is moving quickly.
So looking at now where we are, 2026, what's really exciting you and your peers when it comes to lymphoma? Not necessarily just lymphoma, but blood cancer research at this time.
Yeah. So I think one area of our treatment that has been really game-changing for patients, including patients with lymphoma, but also other diseases, include blood cancers, including myeloma and some types of leukemia, has focused around this concept, this thing that we call immunotherapy. So immuno referring to the immune system, and therapy is obviously treatment, and really learning how we can get the patient's own immune system, particularly these blood cells called T cells. And T cells are the fighter cells of the immune system. They go around our blood and immune system constantly fighting infections, whether it's COVID or whether it's flu. But T cells can also fight cancer. And naturally, some of our T cells are able to recognise cancer cells and kill them and before cancer even develops. So that might be happening without us even knowing. But the treatments that we've developed, these immunotherapies, is really getting the patient's own T cells to do more work, to focus on the cancer a bit more and to give the cancer a bit of a kick. So there are two main types. I don't want to be get too complicated here, but there are two main types of T-cell immunotherapy. One you may have heard of, it's been a little bit in the press in recent years, called CAR T-cell therapy. That's where we take normal T-cells from the patient's blood, and then we reprogram them. They're kind of reprogrammed in a laboratory, and then sent back and given back to the patient, so that the T-cells now only want to focus on killing that particular cancer cell. In the case of lymphoma, that would be a B cell. So it's kind of just reprogramming the T-cell and giving it the kind of the equipment, if you like, and the targeting to hit the cancer cells. That's pretty amazing technology, that you're modifying a blood cell and then giving it back to the patient. The second group is giving a treatment directly into the vein as a drip, what we call a bispecific antibody, and that has two arms. And one arm grabs the cancer cell, recognises and grabs the cancer cell. The other arm recognises and grabs the T cell, the good cell, the fighter cell, brings them together and gives the T cell a bit of a kick, activates it so that the T cell will then kill the B cell. So they're pretty amazing, transformative treatments. And I think in the last 5 to 10 years, they've had the biggest impact, and it really improved how many patients are cured and living longer because of these treatments.
I feel like I need to congratulate you, because I think I understand. And for you to explain that to me, there will undoubtedly be people watching who think, "Oh, I wish you would just talk more about that." So thank you for that, Chris. What seemed impossible, say 10 to 15 years ago, that is now almost routine?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think some of the treatments I've just described, these CAR T-cell treatments or these immunotherapies, I think if you went back 10 or 15 years and you asked me, would this treatment be developed, I would have probably estimated it would be another 20 or 30 years before we got to that point. So I think the speed of development has really been surprising, and I would have maybe said impossible, 10 years ago. And again, I think that's all based on our scientific understanding of why the cancer B cells, in the case of lymphoma, why it develops, how it survives chemotherapy. So some cancer cells either know already or learn how to survive chemotherapy. So you can hitting the cell with a hammer, but nothing's happening. And then learning about why isn't that cell dying when it's hit with the chemotherapy hammer, understanding that, and then working around that and using a different type of treatment. In the case we discussed, these T cells, to be able to hit the cell and kill it in a more precise way. So more of a dagger than a hammer, maybe.
And we've spoken while we've been sat here about how quickly we can get some amazing achievements and how we can accelerate progress. But is there anything that you can think of that really needs to change in order to allow us to keep pushing forward at speed?
I think there are some what I'd call structural problems within the kind of the sector and the health service that make it slower to get new drugs and new trials in. Some of that is related to the general capacity of the NHS. I mean, we've got a fantastic publicly funded health service that's free at the point that people need it, and I think throughout the world that's often recognised as quite an amazing achievement. But we all recognise limitations within the health service. We sometimes can't get scans quickly enough. We haven't got enough scanners, for example. We haven't maybe got enough people to do the tests in the laboratory. Perhaps some of the behind-the-scenes teams, so the legal teams, people looking at these contracts or examining the kind of the safety of a protocol, the kind of desk jobs, if you like. All of these things can slow down the trial opening. But some of this is linked inherently to the NHS, and it has a finite capacity. There isn't an endless money tree that's funding it, and so we have to kind of work within the constraints of our health service. But I think the NHS overall, and even at high government level, I think 2 years ago, I think it was the first time ever that a Prime Minister had used the word clinical trial, and Keir Starmer did a speech saying he wants to make things faster, trying to cut some of the bureaucracy, trying to speed things up. And that also helps the broader UK economy. So pharmaceutical companies, they have a lot of wealth and a lot of resource. They employ a lot of people. So bringing clinical trials in to help our patients, which is the primary goal, also with it often brings extra resource, extra money for the health service or the hospital. So I think there is a way of navigating this, but there are obstacles, there are hurdles. And I think I'd really like to see the timeline further compressed and things be a bit more efficient. So still a bit of work to do.
Thank you for answering that so honestly, Chris. If I may, I just want to focus more on you as a person for a moment or two. How do you deal with the emotional impact of your role? So let's perhaps focus a bit more on your patient contact. And some of the challenges that you'll see, some of the patients whose treatment is unsuccessful. How do you manage the weight of responsibility and emotion?
It's a really good question, and I think, you know, as doctors we do learn early on in our careers about bad news. You know, either having to communicate bad news to a patient that the treatment hasn't worked or that the cancer has returned. And I think it is, you know, first of all, we have to acquire the skills to do that. I think one of the key things about being a doctor generally, but also being particularly as a cancer specialist, is the ability to be able to communicate sensitively and to pick up on the non-verbal cues and really just trying to understand the patient as a person. But even if you become, you know, competent at that over the years, it's still difficult. And you know, sometimes we'll see the result of a scan as a team, and our hearts will sink, you know, and we'll be very disappointed because the treatment hasn't worked. And then you obviously have to communicate that to the patient and their family, and that can be really challenging. How do I cope with that? I guess I look at many of the positives. All the things we've discussed in the last 20 minutes or so, huge positives. We've seen many successful outcomes. We don't forget about the bad outcomes or the negative outcomes, because they're also important, and we can sometimes learn from that. It may not help that individual patient, but we can sometimes learn about why a treatment hasn't worked. So I think focusing on the positives is one, and then just being able to, I guess, mentally separate yourself from the hospital. So, you know, go home to my family. I've got 3 girls. I have to take them to their sports events, help them with their homework, and that kind of thing just helps me switch off, I guess. Yeah, but it can be tricky.
What keeps you going after so many years?
Maybe not quite as old as you think, but no, it's a good question. It comes back to the motivation that we touched on briefly before. I think seeing witnessing the progress, particularly in the last 5 or 10 years, that really is, you know, very positive and very heartwarming. And then looking down the line, looking on the horizon, and seeing these potentially, you know, amazing treatments being developed right now, that I know that pipeline is not going to dry up in the next 10 or 20 years, because you can sometimes see a drug coming through a few years before the patient gets it, whether it's laboratory tests or results from, you know, from pharmaceutical companies, or maybe being tested in a different type of disease, and we say, oh, well, that concept could work in blood cancer. So sometimes you can see those treatments a few years ahead of them coming, and that's a motivation, because again, the focus on the patient, wanting to give them the best chance of a positive outcome. There's definitely a rich pipeline of drugs that are coming our way.
Yeah. And we spoke earlier about role models and mentors, whether they were official or unofficial. If you could talk to any junior doctor or medical student who was thinking about a career in haematology, how would you sell it, or what would you say to them?
Yes, we do have, you know, within our department, because we're a university hospital, we have medical students who come and, you know, observe in our clinics, you know, for a week at a time. And I think one of the first things I try and communicate is this connection between science and people. I mean, medicine, I guess, generally has some of that, but I think haematology is particularly strong at connecting science and what we learn from either laboratories or analysis of scans with patients. So there's a clear kind of narrative, there's a clear connection between science and people. And then again, looking at what we've achieved in the last 5 to 10 years particularly, and looking again at the horizon and seeing what's coming along, I think often those things together are enough to excite at least some medical students to decide to focus on haematology as a specialty.
And I'm going to hone in now specifically on your lymphoma work. There will be people who have been drawn to our podcast looking for information, advice, any kind of guidance. What messages could you give to any patients or families of people who have found the Patients Podcast in their search for looking for lymphoma information as newly diagnosed patients and families?
Yeah, that's a really important question, because it's a really big moment, clearly, in someone's life to have a blood cancer diagnosis, to be told they've got lymphoma, they've been diagnosed with lymphoma, and getting the right information, in the right amounts at the right time from the right sources, that can be challenging. We all know Dr. Google, and we know we can find lots of information on the internet, some of which may not be quite right. So getting reliable information, and that will be from your specialist in the clinic and the team, the specialist nurses or research nurses, and also going to reliable sources of information on the internet, so whether it's charitable bodies that are interested in or funding blood cancers. We have some quite good charities in the UK, so we know we can rely on those for information. So getting the right information, understanding that the word lymphoma particularly refers to a whole group of conditions, so more than 50 different types of lymphoma. So knowing exactly what type of lymphoma you have, is it a B-cell lymphoma, is it a T-cell lymphoma, what subtype of B-cell lymphoma is it, and there's a whole encyclopedia of language that a patient has to learn. We as doctors, we use a lot of jargon, and I think that can be a problem, so translating that into patient-friendly information is really important. So I think get the right information from a reliable source, understand as much as you can or as much as you want to about your condition. Some patients like to know a lot of detail, and some prefer just the headlines, and you can talk to your specialist about that and tell them how you like your information, how much you want to know at what time, and then it would then accumulate. You can't learn everything immediately about your condition. It'll take time for that to build up. And then I would then come back to the issue about clinical research and clinical trials. So once you have the information about your lymphoma, you've got some understanding of what type it is, what the standard treatments might be, then do ask about clinical research and clinical trials. Is there a trial available for me? How does this compare to the normal treatments? What are the potential advantages of taking part in the trial? Are there any disadvantages? And sometimes it's an easier decision than others. Some trials are more finely balanced in that sense. So, but asking the question, is there a clinical trial? How does this compare to standard treatment? What are my options?
Professor Chris Fox, thank you so much for all of the fascinating insight that you've given us today, not only into your role, but what patients can expect as well, and talking to us lots about clinical trials, perfectly placed today on International Clinical Trials Day. Professor Chris Fox, once again, thank you for joining us. And everybody watching, you have been watching Let's Talk Blood Cancer, the Patients Podcast.